Okay, I had a conversation with myself. I said, "Self." I said, "Yes, self. So what's the easiest, most insanely simplified method of distinguishing and differentiating out different types of illumination when it comes to SNR, especially flash photography, versus ambient?" Obviously, we have to mention ambient, which is as low as it gets. And then talk about sync photography. And then people need to differentiate out sync from hypersync. Sync is incredibly reliant upon timing. Most cameras is limited to 1/250th of a second. On the case of the GFX, okay, it is limited to 1/125th of a second. And there have been a lot of people ignorantly saying, you know, you got only 1/125th of a second sync speed on the HSS. Excuse me, 1/125th of a second sync speed on the GFX series cameras. And I say, yes, but you know what you're forgetting in your ignorance is that with every GFX, you have HSS and you have Hypersync capability, which means I could do flash photography with a speedlight or strobe at any shutter speed up to 1/4000th of a second. But we're not talking about the GFX series here. But I just thought I would point that out. Now, I also did a scale out of 1 to 10 about how awesome they are. And of course, it goes from worst, okay, over here, to awesome over here. And I don't call it awesome, I call it godlike. And you notice that nobody, basically on any YouTube photography channel, is talking about these two over here, because they either don't use them or they don't know a damn thing about them. And I actually tend to conclude that it is both. They both don't use them, nor do they know what the hell Hypersync is or what a leaf shutter is. And these two are godlike. These are a 10 out of 10. Let's first talk about ambient. Rate an ambient 2 out of 10 for its awesomeness. Nothing wrong with ambient photography. Most of us do most ambient photography. Ambient illumination, which means ye old happy sun here. Then we have a sync, flash sync photography. Speedlight, fine. HSS, 3 out of 10. HSS, wonderful. Isn't that great? We could open up our aperture, shoot 1/8000th of a second to quench the light so we can shoot, let's say at f1.8 or f1.4, and do HSS. The only problem is that with HSS using the same speed light, let's assume you're using the exact same speed light for flash sync photography, which averages 1/250th of a second between most cameras, and the same speed light with the same camera doing HSS flash photography at say 1/4000th to 1/8000th of a second. That same speed light from meow to meow turns to suck. The reason for that I will explain very, very shortly here. So let's first talk about ambient. We don't need to talk about ambient, do we? We need to talk about sync and HSS. You have two shutter curtains in most cameras. First curtain and second curtain. As the first curtain has fallen and the entire sensor is exposed, we have a sync speed, which is up to averages, most cameras, 1/250th of a second, where the flash occurs, boom, when the entire sensor is exposed right before the second curtain, just like curtains in a movie theater. You know, you have a curtain to the left and a curtain to the right, except in this case we actually have a fall of the first curtain before the start of the fall of the second curtain. So we have, and the typical speedlight flash duration is average about 1/13,000th of a second. So the entire sensor is zapped with whatever power setting. And you have sufficient power. You can do subject flash photography, depending on the power of the speedlight, 20 plus feet. Average is about 15. Okay, so there we got sync flash photography. When the first curtain's down, the second curtain's about to drop. There we go. Over here we have, let's assume in the case of this analogy, HSS with the same speedlight here as we use it over here. This is where things start to suck. Well, no, HSS is wonderful, because now I can do flash photography at, full maximum shutter speed. Yes, you can, but light fall off becomes, light fall off and power, same thing, becomes drastically different, because instead of the entire sensor being exposed, since we're, say, shooting at 1/4000th of a second, for example, okay, you can't have the entire sensor exposed. What happens is that the second curtain, which is here, number 2, is following the first curtain here, and what you have is a moving slit. You have a moving slit, so this would be one part of the exposure, and as the shot at say 1/4000th of a second is ending, we have the first curtain, like say right about here, and the second curtain is right here, and so we have this moving slit. So the way HSS works and why HSS really sucks, it's awesome, everybody loves HSS, but the reason why it really sucks is because all of a sudden your speed light is not that powerful. Kind of sucks. The reason for that is the only way to cover that moving slit is through pulses. Okay, so here we have the slit moving. This is the sensor right here. Okay, so you have this moving slit going across the sensor, and the only way the speed light is actually able to cover the exposure is that if it does this number, and it actually occurs more than this. It goes boom, 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 just like a machine gun. Your speed light, and the interesting thing is that there's capacitors inside your speed light, and the capacitors can only charge and discharge so fast. And the way they actually do HSS flash photography is they partially charge the capacitor, which means you don't get that much of a potent charge, which means your subject can't be that far away. So you have this machine gun pulsation of, you can't see it, but it is happening. Machine gun pulsation from your speed light's xenon tube. This is why you don't do Now, some of the Godox units actually do HSS, but Godox studio strobes are not true studio strobes. Studio strobes, the big, powerful-ass units, the ones that have honking power output, none of them do HSS photography. HSS pulsation, because it's just not possible. The capacitors can't charge and discharge like that, at least not powerfully, they cannot. You have this machine gun burst of light which actually covers the moving slit of the first curtain and second curtain as the sensor is being exposed. That's the only way it works. So it's brrr, except obviously a lot faster than that. This is why HSS, I only give it a 4 out of 10 of awesomeness. You actually have pulsation of light covering that moving slit. As the first curtain falls and the second curtain follows it. Okay? I think I've made that really abundantly clear. Now the interesting thing, this is where nobody understands the difference between HSS and Hypersync. So what's the difference? You know, if you can do, let's say, the maximum shutter speed on like a GFX 1/4000th of a second. Well, if HSS, which you can use like the Godox speed light for Fujifilm, or even the Fujifilm EFX 500 speed light for HSS, you don't use speed lights for Hypersync, by the way. If you could use the Fujifilm speed light for HSS at 1/4000th a second, where does Hypersync come into play here and its importance, and why is it, at least I give it, and Leap Shutter, a 10 out of 10, because it's godlike. It doesn't depend on the moving slit of the faster shutter speed, whether it's 1/4000th or 1/8000th, which doesn't exist on the GFX, any shutter speed. The way Hypersync works, and this occurs now, I know Paul C. Buff is coming out with a Hypersync unit. Currently they have an older Hypersync unit, which is the White Lightning unit, which is insanely powerful. Ooh, really, really, really powerful. The way Hypersync works is, like I said, the average speed light burst is 1/13,000th of a second. The average Hypersync burst, average I said, is 1/300th. Now 1/300th of a second of studio strobe burst is really fat. This is anorexic. 1/13,000th of a second is super, super thin. It's a very small duration of time. 1/300th of a second is really fat. So the reason why Hypersync, you can get full power out of Hypersync, or a tremendous amount more power than you can with HSS, you get back your subject way the hell up, is that since the pulse duration from the huge capacitors inside the large professional, and I should say real studio strobes instead of Godox, and I love Godox speed lights, but Godox studio strobes, I know those work fine, but they're not Hypersync units, nor are they incredibly powerful, is the Hypersync studio strobe burst is one honking, fat, atomic blast of light. Boom! So it doesn't matter. This is the important thing. You see, when your shutter speed is 1/4000th of a second, for example, and you want to drop some serious power, it's still a moving slit, like over here in HSS, because 1/4000th of a second exposure is still 1/4000th of a second of exposure, but the moving slit becomes irrelevant because 1/4000th of a second is really tiny. This huge, long duration, average 1/300th of a second pulse burst of light for hypersync covers everything, any shutter speed. Doesn't matter if it's 1/8000th, 1/12,000th, 1/800th, no matter what the hell it is. Hypersync is godlike. It's because it's powerful and it covers everything. Boom! This is why Hypersync is awesome, and HSS, by comparison, is like unprofessional suck. It's not to say HSS is incredibly useful, because a speed light is far, far more portable than a studio strobe and a huge lithium pack and a light stand, so, you know, have to be pragmatic here. A leaf shutter, someone's going to say this looks like an anus or something like that. A leaf shutter, we have Hasselblad. The leaf shutter's in the lenses, or in the case of like Fujifilm, like the X70 or XF10, which I was recently reviewing, actually has the shutter, instead of first curtain, second curtain, is just like an aperture. Not exactly, but pretty much exactly. Depends on the leaf shutter. Like the ones on the X70 and X10, XF10 of the Fujifilm actually have three-bladed. So they're like a three-bladed aperture on a camera lens. They're opening and closing just like the diaphragm on a lens aperture. And the reason why it's godlike, and it will work, by the way, there's actually several reasons why leaf shutter is godlike and absolutely the epic tatas, is that you can use any old crappy speed light, you know, made in the 90s or something. It doesn't matter who the hell makes it. As long as it will fire it, it will work on the leaf shutter. So it's like, well, I've got a Fujifilm camera and it's got a leaf shutter. It's like, doesn't matter. You know, you just get yourself a trigger and any old sort of crappy camera, or you'll use the tiny little built-in flash on the tiny leaf shutter cameras like the XF10. Say, well, this is important. People don't realize this. You'll use that to fire another speed light. It's in slave mode, wherever the hell you want to put it. And you could use any old friggin' speed light that's got an optical slave right here. So when this fires, then it'll set off your speed light. But also, very important, on any conventional camera, where the tiny little built-in xenon tube on the little point-and-shoot size cameras, and it's a tiny little tube on the XF10, for example, it is actually, anybody that normally looks at that, they're thinking, well, those little lights are not that powerful. In most cases, they're not, but on a leaf shutter camera, they become much, much more potent by several factors. You can actually read articles about this. There's even an article on Strobist about this. Because of the fact that the sensor is being exposed via the aperture blades from the leaf shutter mech inside the lens, in this case a permanently affixed lens, or we could be talking about Hasselblad lenses, which are extremely expensive. Leaf shutter lenses are very expensive. Then you actually have godlike level of capability. It becomes not only more powerful, but it also lets you use any damn thing you want. All it has to do is fire. There's no such thing. You don't have to worry about sync, which is timing. Sync, basically, you know, in synchronization, this is timing. You don't really have to worry about that with leaf shutter. I mean, as long as you let a strobe or a speed light fire via the commander mode from the flash and optical slave mode, or fire it somehow, then you know, you don't have to worry about. You don't have to worry about. There's no first curtain and second curtain to worry about because it's a leaf shutter. And also, too, the smaller strobes are far more effective, much, much more effective. Actually, it is the case that the little xenon flash tube that's on the little XF10 is far, far, far more powerful than what people will give it credit for. These are why Hypersync and leaf shutter, which nobody talks about on YouTube, on photography, nobody talks about them. But these are 10 out of 10. This is where all the awesomeness happens. Leaf shutter lenses are very expensive, and leaf shutter cameras are not common. There should be a lot more leaf shutter permanent fixed, like the XF100, excuse me. I should have mentioned that already, which is also a leaf shutter. The the X100T, the X100S, and the current X100F, which I have, that's also a leaf shutter. Leaf shutter is incredible. But We got ambient, sync, which is timing. And of course, this is where the first curtain is dropped and the sensor is completely exposed. Before the second curtain starts to drop, this is what most people use. And then everybody loves talking about HSS, but HSS sucks hardcore compared to Hypersync. This is where the real action happens. You drop an atomic bomb of light and you can tell your subject to back the hell up 30 feet and still shoot them wide open on your lens at 1/4000th of a second, for example, and drop some serious light, because 1/300th of a second of atomic light beats the hell out of 1/13,000th of a second from a friggin' speed light. I hope I made that pretty clear. Here's your 5 different levels of lighting, from suckiest to epic awesome: ambient, sync, HSS, hypersync, and leap shutter. I hope I made that more clear, because nobody's really made a video defining that in simple. If you want to do more research on that, do let me know if you have any questions on anything, and I'm going to catch you later. Thank you so much for watching. Happy holidays and all that stuff.